Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's revolutionary idea is humanism, not 21st century humanism, but medieval humanism. I'm going to be talking to the historian Erik Nelson about how a movement that began in northern Italy changed the way human beings thought about themselves and their possibilities, and in particular, what it meant for the traditional hold of the church, of the empire, of God. How humanism changed human self-understanding. Erik, humanism is a notoriously difficult term to pin down, but just so people know what we're talking about, roughly where and when I say humanism to you, what comes to mind in terms of time and place? Can you demarcate it at all, or give us a sort of central place and period that we can work out from?
Yeah, was it John Lucas who said in the 90s that all the isms have become wasms? That was sort of overly optimistic about political isms. And I think much the same thing is the case with the scholarly isms. And, there's been no shortage of people who have challenged the coherence of the idea of humanism, that it even existed, that it picks out an identifiable moment in intellectual history. But it never goes away because there is very deep truth to it. So really, we're talking about an intellectual movement, cultural movement that begins in Italy in the 14th century and then sort of ramifies throughout Europe for the next 200 years in various different guises and with enormous consequences. But we're really talking in the first instance about something that gets going in 14th century Italy.
And it has many characteristics, but maybe at the heart of it, at least to start with, is the idea of a rescue or a recovery of the texts and the ideas of the ancient world. And in the cliched schoolbook version of history, there was something called the ancient world, then there was something called the Dark Ages. Don't think we call them that anymore. And then there was something called the Renaissance, which was a rebirth, a recovery, and humanism plays a key part in that. But the thing that is a little puzzling about this story is it's not as if before humanism people weren't reading texts from the ancient world. Aristotle, the most celebrated at that time of all the ancient philosophers, was widely read long before there was such a thing as humanism. So what was distinctive about this? Was it the range of things that people wanted to recover and read? Was it the way in which they read Roman texts? Was it something else? What made it different from what had gone before? Assuming it doesn't just go Dark Ages humanism.
Yeah, that's the question, because as you say, you mentioned Aristotle, and the revival of Aristotelianism is a 13th century phenomenon. But even before that, it's not as if the Roman authors were, for the most part, many of them were not available to any degree. People like Tacitus were kind of rediscovered much later. But, Cicero, Sallust, Livy, these were texts that were available, at least some of the corpus of these writers was available earlier. And so part of the answer is just the range. That's to say, and I imagine we'll come back to this, an enormous shift happens when these people start being able to read Greek and are able to sort of read that entire continent of literature that didn't exist in Latin translation, unlike, say, Aristotle, who did. And so part of it is that. And then, of course, another dimension of that story is also the recovery of Hebrew texts, and both of those, the sort of Greek revival, the Hebrew revival, are enormously important parts of the broader story of humanism. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But part of it, I think, is that even in the case of the texts that had been available in some form and had been valued, the sort of cultural program was different. The attitude was different. And here, there's been a great deal of, as you might imagine, scholarly debate about what was most salient about humanism. And for a long time, the sort of dominant paradigm was that humanism was really a philological project about sort of writing proper Ciceronian Latin. And that's basically what it was. I tend to be much more sympathetic to views that this was really, as you say, a cultural movement, a program that really set off from a pervasive sense of civilizational crisis in the 14th century. And so, really, I think to understand what happens next, you have to understand the sheer magnitude of what was going wrong in Latin Christendom in the 14th century. The truth is, as I was thinking about what I would say to you about this, I was thinking I have to make a list because the list of things that goes wrong in the 14th century is so vast. So, I mean, I'm not even going to talk about the most massive famine in European history up until that point, which happened, let's say, was probably the most severe in the early 14th century, and climate change, which is also a major story. I mean, the world was getting cooler. Europe was getting much colder, and that had enormous consequences. But the big ones are, first of all, the complete breakdown of the two most important European institutions of the Middle Ages. On the one hand, the Catholic Church, and on the other, the Holy Roman Empire. And the sort of series of crises that sort of afflicted these two massively important institutions, the ones that really had been the organizing framework in which medieval Europeans took themselves to be operating, was enormous. So in the case of the church, it's a very long story, but the two headlines would be, first of all, the Avignon papacy. That's to say the 70-year period in the 14th century when the popes decamped from the Vatican and went to Avignon in France, where they were essentially under the control of the French monarchy. And then immediately after that, the schism, which goes on for almost 40 years, where there are rival papal claimants. And so it's a complete disaster. The sort of institutional church is in thoroughgoing crisis. And at the same time, the Holy Roman Empire had been in a sort of precipitous decline for quite a long time, and roughly a century earlier had had its own sort of equivalent of the schism, where there were rival claimants and no proper emperor was crowned for decades. And so the ability of these institutions to project power across Europe had been massively compromised, and their authority, their legitimacy, had been massively compromised. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't, by the time you get into the 13th and early 14th centuries, you get some of the most rabid statements in political theory of defenses of both papal and imperial power. Think of Dante's treatise on monarchy at the beginning of the 14th century, or roughly contemporary Giles of Rome gives you this sweeping idea of universal papal monarchy and so on. But these were being offered precisely because everything was in shambles, and neither of these institutions was actually able to do anything like unify Christendom. Then, in the midst of all of that, you get the Black Death, right smack in the middle of the 14th century, and roughly a third of the European population dies. And, Europe is not going to recover, even in sheer numerical terms, for 200 years. So it's a lot going wrong. Also, the collapse of the Latin Crusader kingdom in the Holy Land. So that's effectively the failure of the crusading projects, and also the deterioration, and then finally in the 15th century, ultimately the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. So it's a period in which quite a lot is going wrong.
And the failure of the crusading projects, the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, is also a story about the rise and spread of Islam, which is there around the edges of this whole story.
Absolutely. And the sense that, not just the sense, the undeniable reality that Latin Christendom is in retreat, is under enormous threat, and is in deep pervasive crisis. And the question was essentially, why are we in terrible crisis, and what can we do to get out of it? And I think the best way to understand humanism is as an answer to those questions.
One can imagine two different kinds of answers to those questions. So if in the middle of this world-shaking series of crises, what we might now call the polycrisis, that's a 21st century phrase for what sounds exactly like what was going on in the 14th century. And one response to it is to turn back to the ancient world through the discovery and recovery of ideas and texts from a millennium plus earlier. That might be seen as a kind of escape or a retreat, a sort of form of escapism in a way. In the horror around us, we go to another world, which we can read about and mine. Or it could be seen as looking for solutions, that there is in a more stable version of an empire, or in Republican Rome, a more stable version of a polity of a state. Looking back to pre-Christian authors and finding in them philosophical truths. Did humanism have both of those things going on in it, both escape as well as the search for answers? Are those two things potentially consistent or not?
It's a very good question. I think that humanism was predominantly the second. That's to say, it was really a program. And there really was this sense that there was a way out of this. And it involved, as you say, the process of recovery. But I also don't think you're wrong to notice that for a number of humanists, I mean, someone like Petrarch, who in some ways is the canonical first humanist, his kind of seclusion, living his days with the ancients, escaping, as he says, from the dregs and corruption of the world around him. I think there is an element of escape and consolation in sort of living amongst these great men and these great texts as he saw it. But I think the overwhelming emphasis is on changing Europe. And so, to that degree, I don't think it was, in the usual sense, escapist.
And was it changing Europe through education primarily? That is, the result of this movement would be a new set of people who had been educated to think differently. Or was it, in addition to that, or maybe even instead of that, to change the organization, the political life, the institutional life? As it was it to inhabit these institutions that were failing with people who had read these texts, or was it to find in these texts new ways of reimagining these institutions?
I think it's a little of both. I'd say the headline is that they thought that, particularly since these are Italians, they're living amidst the visible ruins and relics of what they took to be unquestionably the most successful civilization in human history, that is Rome, that managed to conquer the world and spread this extraordinary civilization. And they absolutely believed that this sort of secret sauce that they had could be rediscovered. And that if we go back to the study of antiquity, and this, as you say, was necessarily a philological project in the first instance, we have to go back and read these texts to learn proper Latin. We want to write proper Latin because it's sort of good for you. And we want to read the right texts and study them and study the sort of curriculum that's come down from the ancient world, from whence we get the term humanism, although it's very important to say that's a 19th century term. It's not that anyone in that period used it. But what they talked about was, for instance, what they called the studia humanitatis, the study of humanity, of what we call the humanities, rhetoric, history, philosophy, literature, which they took to be a way of inculcating virtue and civilization, kind of countering the barbarism and corruption of the contemporary world, and giving, in the first case, Italians, but then more broadly, Europeans, the wherewithal to rebuild civilization in the model, in the first instance, of Rome. And the degree to which this is all about Rome and reimagining, rebuilding, restoring what was lost when the barbarians, the Goths, destroyed the Roman Empire, it's just pervasive. That's what they take themselves to be doing.
And what did they see as their relationship to the ancient world? So as you say, in the first instance, we're talking about Italians, but this is not just an Italian project. This becomes a European project, and it's a human project. I mean, that's one of the things that's going on here. Did they think that there was a gulf separating them in time that could be bridged so that in a way they could make a direct connection? They could speak to these people, though they couldn't speak back? Or was it also about understanding the contingencies of history? So this is a scholarly project, it's an educational project, it's a historical project. It's about thinking about time. And one of the things they were doing was recovering stories and evidence from a world which was different from theirs. And it gave them a perspective on some of the relative contingency of their situation. So you can imagine two ways this could go, one of which is you see the human connection and you think they could be us and we could be them, or you see over the space of 1,000+ years just how contingent human affairs are. And there is something you can learn from that too in a world of universal claims, of failed universal claims of the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire. There is something very appealing about the idea that what you recover from reading about the past is a sense of contingency.
It's a great question. I think that because this is also a moment in which the reading of classical history, various kinds of classical history, particularly as you get into the later 14th and into the 15th century, is changing the way that people understand the development and character of human societies and how they change. There is certainly some truth to the idea that they're increasingly aware of the enormous importance of contingency in historical explanation. But what they don't have, I'd say for the most part, I mean, obviously, whenever you're doing this, we're dealing in such sweeping generalizations that I'm sure, once I think for 10 seconds, I'll think of an exception. But in general, what they don't have is this idea that the past is just past. I mean, in the sense of, a foreign country, unavailable to us. What they had worked for them, but we're fundamentally different. The idea is that this travels, that this can be revived, and that their ideas are as good for us now as they were for them then. And this, of course, has expressions in almost every area of cultural production, not just the writing of history or the doing of philosophy, political theory, or what have you, but also art, architecture, science, and so on. So I think in general, what's animating all this is the idea that one can go home again, if you see what I mean. I mean, what you don't have is this particular kind of historicity that says this was a kind of cultural world that fit that particular moment, but which is going to be deeply inappropriate to our cultural moment because of the vast chasm that separates us. That I don't think they had, for the most part.
They were all Christians, I think it's fair to say. I mean, if any of them weren't, they were keeping it to themselves. So what did this then do to the Christian understanding, never mind of tenets of the religion, but of time and of the relationship to the past? To be a Christian is to have a relationship with a particular event in the past, and it's an event that took place in the middle of the story that these people are recovering. So some of what they are interested in predates the life of Christ, and some of it comes after the life of Christ and comes after the birth of the Christian church. So what does that do to the Christian understanding of time? How much of a struggle was it to be a humanist and also a good Christian? We'll come on to some of the people who may have really blown that up, but
it's so important and there's so many dimensions to it, but let me just pick out two. You can think of them both under the broader heading of conceptualizations of time, although they pick out slightly different issues. The major one, I mean, in a way, is the fall. That's to say, the major event in the history of Christian time before the incarnation is the fall in traditional Christian theology. And of course, we don't want a caricature of medieval and scholastic views about the fall. There's an enormous variety, but everyone agrees that an enormous change in human nature occurred when the fall occurred. Right at the beginning, human nature was deformed, the will was placed in bondage, human rational faculties are deeply compromised and tainted by the legacy of this catastrophe, and that there is a corresponding humility about what it is possible for human beings to achieve. This is a view of human nature that emphasizes the degree to which it's been quite literally degraded, I mean, taken down. And so one of the major phenomena that is sort of present in humanism, and is what made it suspect to so many of its critics, is that there doesn't seem to be much room for the idea of the fall in this humanist project. The idea is that we can sort of go back and do classical moral philosophy and then political philosophy again. We can learn how to be virtuous. We can perfect ourselves so that we can be virtuous, glorious, meritorious. The idea of merit is an enormously important part of humanist culture. They wanted these virtuous people, the ones who were the most virtuous and had really undergone this training and perfected their characters through the study of the ancient world. They wanted these people to be ruling. And so there seems to be a great deal of perfectionism in this story, in the sense of a confidence in the ability of human nature on its own, human beings using their faculties and consulting the sort of vast repository of texts that survive from the ancient world to really do quite extraordinary things on their own steam. And so this is not a picture that seems to make much room for the fall and for the idea of grace. And so that's one biggie, I'd say. Although, as you quite rightly emphasize, they all were Christians, and they all wanted to insist that nothing that they were doing was incompatible with Christian orthodoxy, which is sort of the church's job, and they're sort of doing this other thing. But in general, that was one major shift. So, in the direction of what they would have recognized at the time as Pelagianism. The other one is maybe more concretely an issue of how you experience time, because it's fair to say that the ancient world, the Greek and Roman world, has a conception of time that is quite cyclical in character. Now, there are very important qualifications to this, but in general, it would be fair, as a jumping off point, it would be fair to say that these are civilizations that think that history goes through repeated cycles. Their civilizations are born, they flourish, they die. There's often then a catastrophic flood or something like that, so that we forget everything that happened before, and then it all starts over again. And the world keeps going. And of course, you get someone like Aristotle who argues that the world is eternal. This is a kind of article of faith of the ancient world. Now, there are in the ancient world, particularly in the sort of Hellenistic world, the beginning of a sort of more linear conception of time. But Christianity is an enormous sort of shift. This idea that, human history has a beginning and then it will have an end, right? The world was created. There was the fall, there was the incarnation, there will be the return of Christ in majesty, and that will be that, right? So history is moving toward this final consummation, and we're sort of, in Augustine's famous image, pilgrims. We're sort of hanging out here, waiting for the end to come. And of course, Christians, particularly early Christians, thought it was going to come quite soon. So you have these two very different ways of experiencing time. And humanists are tasked in some way with the project of putting them together. That's to say, they have to keep Christian eschatological time because they're Christians, but they're very gripped increasingly by these classical ideas of cyclicity within that chronological framework. And this really becomes more and more pronounced as we get into the late 15th century, early into the 16th century, when they begin discovering ancient texts which were unknown in the earlier period. The most important is the Greek historian Polybius, who is known a bit earlier, but the crucial bit of his history where he gives you this cyclical theory of constitutional change and civilizational ascent and decline, and then we start the game over again. All of that is discovered much later at the sort of very end of the 15th century, and people really don't have it to hand until the early 16th century. So it sort of gathers pace as we go.
What you've just described is a version of thinking about time and thinking about history, the Christian version, which is all about the big events. The one at the beginning, the fall, we leave the Garden of Eden, the one you might say in the middle or near the end, which is Christ and the crucifixion and Christ's ascension and then the return. Could one say that the real difference that humanism makes is it's not just about what happens in between? So again, in that classical version, the flood that erases memory, that's not the event you're interested in. You're interested in the things that happen between the floods. But it's also about the details, and it's consistent with the general ethos of the movement as an educational movement, which is it is about detail. It's about the close study of texts. It's about spotting the things that are in the margins.
And then, of course, very quickly, not just texts, but also objects, right? I mean, it's also, when we're talking about the 15th, 16th century, we're talking about the beginnings of archaeology, the beginnings of actual historical use of the physical world in that way.
So in some ways, it's about the particular against some wide range of universal claims in a world, as you described it, where these universal claims looked a bit bust in various respects. They weren't holding together universally. They were falling apart, not just around the edges, but in the middle. So what you have is a movement that really is a radical alternative to a way of thinking which almost excludes most of the things that we experience in our lives as being things of importance, because the big stuff is what frames it. Is it fair to say that humanism is the beginning of an understanding of human experience that really celebrates what happens inside the frame.
I think that it's enormously important in advancing that sort of shift in perspective. We don't want to say that there was none of this before, not least because if we're talking about scholasticism, we're talking about Aristotelianism. And Aristotle, he was interested in the details. And one of the salient elements of his thought is this kind of particularism, right? That's to say that cultures are different, peoples are different. There's no one size fits all for, how they should live and how they should be governed. It depends what climate you live in. It depends how big the city is, what you do for a living. All of these different things will determine what's right, what's best for you. And even in the sort of high Middle Ages, even people who are arch imperialists, again, I'll just sort of think of Dante for a moment. I mean, it's one of the very striking facts about this sweeping assertion of imperial power that Dante writes on monarchy, that the Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, is just the heir to the Roman Empire and is the universal Lord of the earth, certainly supreme over the church in temporals and all the rest. When you then get to the fine print, though, he says, yeah, but that's at sort of what we would call the federal level. There can be a universal empire, but at the level of the local, you can have these city communes and principalities and aristocracies and large territorial states and really little ones, and that's all going to depend on good Aristotelian grounds on the particulars of the place. So this is there.
But it's there framed by the universal idea. It's sort of working towards the universal. It's not the particular for its own sake.
What you don't get nearly as much in humanism, although there are very important exceptions, is this insistence on situating the particular within the context of one of the classical medieval universal institutions, one or the other. It is a story of the move away from that. I think that's true, with exceptions.
The account that I gave was mainly contrasting humanism with that eschatological Christian perspective on time. But as you say, that had long had to coexist with a close reading of Aristotle, and scholastics were also very interested in detail and detailed analysis. It's one of the things that humanism did to make it harder to hold those things together, in a sense, that humanism created more of a wedge between the things that had been assumed had to go together, which is the truths of the ancient world and the truths of the Bible. That humanism started to make that look like a project that might not necessarily end well.
I think the real issue is not so much that humanists began to doubt that it was possible to have a worldview in which classical wisdom and Christian biblical religion could coexist. They insisted constantly that they could, but rather just the thoroughgoing sense, which of course is completely absent from scholasticism, that the entire modern world, of which scholasticism is a central part, is fundamentally corrupt and disfigured, that all of this is barbarism. I mean, it is quite a reactionary project. Everything that sort of exists around us, we have to start over. We start over, but we start over by going back. And of course, since this is a very characteristic feature of later revolutionary movements, I mean, this is an important instance of this. I mean, it's a revolution about going back.
Turning the wheel all the way around to the beginning.
And sort of cleaning the stables, getting rid of all of this, and thinking of European civilization in this period, including Christian civilization, as corrupt, as built on a series of barbaric accretions of misunderstanding, ignorance, and bad scholarship, right? So one of the major, really extraordinary articles of faith is the idea that this can be cured through scholarship, that we're going to go back and we're going to read and write proper Latin, and we're not going to write this sort of barbarous scholastic Latin. We're going to learn Greek. And that's the sort of second wave, which is intimately connected to the collapse of Christian empire in the East, because as Byzantium is in its death throes, all of these emigres come to Italy and they begin to teach people Greek. So for the first time, although there was some very rare knowledge of Greek in, let's say, the High Middle Ages, this is completely new. Now these people can read Aristotle, not the scholastic Aristotle, but the real one, And they think of themselves as kind of correcting all of the corruptions and getting to this original source of wisdom that's been hidden behind this veil. And of course, most radically, this is going to be true about the Bible itself, because they are going to be the ones who want to, particularly as we move north in this story, they're going to be the ones who want to read the Gospels in the original Greek, and then eventually what they call the Old Testament, right, the Hebrew Bible, in the original Hebrew, and to correct this sort of corrupt Vulgate Latin with, enormous theological consequences. So all of this is about, we're going to do all of this through proper scholarship. We're going to get back to the proper vision of Rome and classical greatness, and we're going to learn how to remake it. We're going to get back to the original primitive Christianity, Christ's true church, and get away from all of these corrupt accretions that have built up over the years, and so on and so forth. So this idea of recovery through scholarship is just the red thread all the way through.
And what you've just painted is a picture of a movement, as you said, that it can be described as reactionary, and it's certainly an elite movement. This is about scholarship. Scholarship is an elite activity.
Unapologetically, yes.
This is not for the masses. And yet great claims have been made for what is sometimes called civic humanism as being the origin story of later revolutionary movements, which aren't what you've just described, running right the way through to the English revolutions of the 17th century, the American Revolution of the 18th century that we'll be talking to you about later on. And that's one of the puzzles with humanism, I think, and trying to make sense of it. Are those claims, should we now think of them as overblown? The idea that coming out of this recovery act and this act of elite scholarship was a set of ideas that did, in the end, animate a view of what was possible politically, that anchored power and legitimacy in places and among people that hadn't been possible before, leading to a sense of political possibility that really explodes in the modern world into what we call revolutionary politics. Is that whole story still plausible, or is it overblown, do you think?
I think there's something to it, but I'd say I'm in the minority now. The thing that's usually said now is that civic humanism, which was a concept that was introduced by the great historian Hans Baron, what he called Bürgerhumanismus, this particular idea, its sort of time has passed, I think a lot of people would now say. And as it was initially presented, there was a lot wrong with it. So part of the revision and the critique is entirely plausible and salutary, because there are a couple problems. One is that Baron basically thought that this set of ideas, which we also tend to call republicanism, also very fraught and complicated as an ism, but this sort of burst suddenly onto the scene about the year 1400 as the sort of result of a very particular moment in Italian history where Florence, which has this kind of communal city government that we now know as Republican, although the use of the term in that sense is itself an artifact of this period. And its neighbor to the north, Milan, which was a duchy, so it had dukes, they're in the middle of a war, and it's kind of part of the Florentine propaganda campaign to say, yay, us, we're Republicans, and therefore we're free, as opposed to these corrupt enslaved northerners with their seigneurial government. No one thinks that anymore, because all of the stuff that these Florentine figures are talking about and all the texts that they're using and the particular ways in which they're using them are earlier than that. So the starting gun story is not plausible. The other major problem with it is that its extent has tended to be greatly exaggerated, in the sense that it would be totally wrong to think that humanism and civic humanism, let's say, are coterminous, right? That they're overlapping. The category of humanism is vastly larger. Vast numbers of people who were humanists were in no way what could be described as civic humanists. They were, for the most part, living under princes or hereditary lords. They were perfectly happy with that form of government. Many of them thought it was the best. Petrarch himself, the founding father of humanists, writes a long letter, which is his mirror for princes, right? His kind of advice book for a prince, Francesco de Carrara. So thinking of humanism as sort of reducing to civic humanism and being congenitally Republican is clearly wrong. So is there nothing to be said for it? I don't think so. I think there is something to be said for it. And really, it gets back to your question about history and how it's understood, particularly the sort of mapping of Christian history onto what we would call secular history, right? Onto particularly classical history. Because what does begin to be challenged in the 14th and 15th centuries in these kind of holdout republics, I'm now going to use this word without the scare quotes. Most of the Italian cities, there had been hundreds of these republics, and they had all gone princely over the course of the 13th century into the 14th. The holdouts were the famous ones: Florence, Venice, Lucca, and so on. And the humanists in these cities, particularly in Florence, do develop a very different way of understanding Roman history in relation to Christian history, which is enormously important, I think. So it was a kind of article of faith from the church fathers on that Rome had reached its greatest glory, its zenith, under the Caesars, under monarchy, that the Republic was a sort of factional mess, and that the great period of Rome is what we call the imperial period, the period of one-man rule. And this was bound up in a really important way with their understanding of Christian history, because one of their reasons for thinking this was that God had sent Jesus into the world under the reign of Augustus, thereby, they thought, showing his favor to this form of government. And then it was the spread of the Roman Empire under the Caesars that providentially allowed the spread of the gospel. So the whole Christian story is bound up with this idea. And if you think about, just to go back to Dante again, not the monarchy this time, but the Divine Comedy, the Commedia, when you go to the Inferno, you get all the way to the bottom, the very last level, and you have Lucifer, and he's clutching in his hands and sort of munching on the great traitors, right? And who are they? On the one side, it's Judas Iscariot, and on the other, Brutus and Cassius, those who killed Caesar. So these are the lowest of the low, the great traitors, the betrayers, those who murdered their rightful king, not tyrannicides who were fighting for the freedom of Rome. This is absolutely central to the medieval understanding of Roman and Christian history and how they interact. And what you get in this period is, and there are a couple of antecedents, but for the most part, it's this period, is a repudiation from these city republics of this story. So on their account, Rome reaches its greatness under what we call the Republic, the regime of the Senate, the consuls, the tribunes. And then it declines, its corruption sets in under the rule of the Caesars. So they're going back to the Republican nostalgics like Cicero, like Tacitus, like Sallust, who tell this story of a kind of glorious republic that gives way to corruption. And they're, of course, connecting it to their own form of government, the idea that it's only in a republic of this kind that you can have free men. And it's only when you have libertas, when you have freedom understood in this way, that you're going to be capable of virtue and glory and greatness. And so that, I think, is true and important, that you do get this picture. And these writers have a very long afterlife in early modern Europe. And so I don't think it's wrong categorically to connect these developments to the development of later Republican ideas and eventually in sort of democratic ideas. But we just have to be careful, because it's the danger is overstating it, overgeneralizing, and particularly because there's been such an enormously disproportionate amount of attention paid to a very small number of Renaissance texts in political theory that have been translated, up until relatively recently, the very small number that had actually been translated into English. And one of the major advantages we now have, thanks to the Tati Renaissance Library, is that the vast quantity of Neo-Latin humanist political theory, history, rhetoric, and so on that isn't remotely like this is now available to people who don't read Neo-Latin, which is tough going.
So that then leads on to a question about, we talked about where this starts, but whether and where we can draw a kind of limit to it, or when humanism becomes something else. There is a difference between the sort of civic republicanism that we've just been talking about and what we later call republicanism, but there may be a story that connects them. There is a much broader idea of humanism that encompasses a much wider range of thinkers and texts than that, although probably some notion of virtue connects all of them. I think, would that be fair to say? There's across this, even if it's not assumed that you have to be in a republic for freedom and virtue to be possible. But there are some thinkers who either are held up as emblematic of some aspect of humanism or possibly signifying the end of it. And I think one of them, not least because this is one of the thinkers who has been widely read in English, is Machiavelli. So then we're talking about the beginning of the 16th century. By the time we get to Machiavelli, are we at the edge of humanism or are we still in the story? We're going to have to say a little bit about what Machiavelli might have said and thought to answer that question. But is that where we start to move from something that is recognizably anchored in that 1400 version of humanism to something that is closer to what we think of as modern ideas of morality and politics? Or are we still in the humanist story with Machiavelli?
I think we're very much still in the humanist story with Machiavelli, which isn't to say that he's in any way an orthodox humanist. I mean, I think that the best way to understand him is as a kind of internal critic of humanism. That is, someone who's saying something like, well, if you humanists really take seriously and are interested in what you profess to be interested in, you should be arguing very different things.
You humanists or we humanists? Because if it's you humanists, then we're at the edges.
I think he very much considers himself part of the project of the ancient revival, this kind of recuperative story. After all, the whole point is what is the secret of Roman greatness, particularly in the Discorsi, and how can we learn from it and arrange our political, social, military worlds in such a way as to emulate the Romans? He's still very much engaged in that kind of project. And he's still very interested in these humanist ideas of honor and glory and greatness and empire, and that this is what we're in business for. And he also has a similarly Pelagian anthropology, that is his understanding of human nature, is that we're capable of great feats. We can do great things. And what he thinks, though, is that the traditional virtues, as understood in humanist literature via Cicero and these other ancient texts, are a bad fit with that scheme of values. That if you're really interested in glory and greatness and empire, then you have to be willing to understand virtue, or what he calls virtu, in a very different way, that tells you that doing things like breaking your promises or not being liberal or engaging in various kinds of behavior that are frowned upon in the classical moralists, that doing that is actually necessary if you want to realize these ends. But broadly speaking, he's kind of right in the middle of this project, which is going very strong in the 16th century. I think where it changes and becomes something else is when it's no longer understood. I mean, so you might say that lots of things that we recognize as modern come out of the humanist movement: critical scholarship, biblical criticism, and the entire modern disciplines of philology, archaeology, all of this stuff. But eventually, they sort of float free of this original program, which is one of recovery, of rebuilding all this. And I think that's the major difference. So, to talk about one dimension of this that I've thought about a lot, and we haven't talked about so much, this humanist paradigm that we've been talking about chiefly in sort of Roman and then somewhat in Greek terms has this Hebraic dimension, right? Because eventually these are the people who start learning Hebrew initially so that they can read and get a correct philological understanding of the Hebrew Bible. But eventually, the program becomes much more sweeping. And what they want to do is reconstruct and then get back to this same process of recovery, recuperation, this kind of pristine Hebrew wisdom and the unfiltered word of God, and particularly at a certain point, his constitutional design, this thing that they call the Hebrew Republic, the political constitution that God designs, which, since he's perfect, is something that we should all study and try to emulate. Once you get sort of into the 18th century, once higher biblical criticism has really gotten going, and you get an entire intellectual culture that no longer takes the Bible seriously as revelation, this whole project stops making any sense, right? And so you get the philology. I mean, they're still reading Hebrew and able to sort of do this critical scholarly work, but it's sort of cut off from what was initially animating it, which was a project of recovery, recuperation, a sense that in order for us to be better, we have to go back. It's sort of clear that people lose faith in that idea, that actually you get the idea that, well, the moderns are superior to the ancients. We're able to go beyond them, understand things better. We've solved problems that they couldn't have dreamt of solving in science, in our own politics, and so on. And then you're in a recognizably different world.
So I completely understand from that Machiavelli belongs in the previous one. Machiavelli is still trying to recover something. Though you could say, as you phrased it, when he says you humanists or we humanists, what he's trying to say is also that this movement, humanism, has itself started to get stuck in various ways, to sort of reproduce itself in ways that mean it's no longer got the critical edge that it once had. And so we are at least by that point in an age where a humanist like Machiavelli can a little bit blow up the project in order to save it.
There's that, and then the almost exactly contemporary is the Reformation, which, again, leads to a new wave of skepticism directed at this project because it was, although many of the great humanists, people like Erasmus, who were doing this work, didn't become Protestants, some, like Melanchthon and others, did. And the idea that this was a sort of short route to this sort of dismemberment of Christendom also arises. So by the time you get into the 16th century, there are major new developments that are causing people to rethink the humanist project and take stock of its implications in very different ways. But the project itself is still going strong in that period.
So then the last question is about the word itself, humanism, which has come to mean something different, I think, in the 20th and 21st centuries, because it's about the human. What we've been talking about is something more specific than just, I think if it was just about the human, we wouldn't be able to define it. So and humanism has come to mean, among other things, deep skepticism about religion, the acceptance of certain scientific, biological, evolutionary truths about who we are, which it's a 19th and then post-19th century product. A lot of people choose to get married in humanist ceremonies, and that doesn't mean that what they do is they read Livy and talk about the glory that was Rome. It means they celebrate what it means to be human, freed from superstition, but also actually probably from religion. But it's also true that the word humanism, in that earlier sense that we were talking about it has a breadth that means that various people, I'm thinking of Montaigne or Shakespeare and others, they're celebrated as products of humanist culture, not just because it wouldn't be possible to be Montaigne or to be Shakespeare without having imbibed of the educational project in one way or another and accepted many of its principles, but also because in the end there is in humanism a kind of self-knowledge that it requires the people who embark on this project eventually to reflect a little bit on what it means to be human without filtering that question through higher schemes of thought which already have an answer built into them. So it's a project of reflection, of self-knowledge, self-consciousness, so that people do sometimes say that Shakespeare is the great humanist or Montaigne is the great humanist. By that point, have we stretched the term too far or not?
It's a great question because particularly the examples you were giving are two people who had humanist education. I mean, that's a proper humanist education. They were definitely that kind of humanist. And they're drawing from the full range of these sources. And to the extent that we're then asking a question about the degree to which people who, as a sort of product of humanism or as a longer durée implication or consequence of humanism, people no longer feeling the need to situate their views and projects into, let's say, a Christian scheme. There is a sense, as I was trying to explain, or at least for the critics of humanism, that was always the danger of it, right? That it was always paganizing. These people were constantly accused of forsaking Christianity and embracing fill in the blank, Aristotle, Cicero, whomever. And so the association between humanism and the kind of reverence for pagan antiquity that in some way muscles out the Christian framework, at least in the eyes of critics, is part of this story itself. And so that's perfectly fair. I think what happens, and this is its own fascinating intellectual history is that in the 19th century, there is this attempt by largely German, largely Kantian or post Kantian philosophers to recruit humanism as their own ideological, intellectual, philosophical backstory. And to say, well, that really the roots of the Kantian project and this entire way of grounding everything on reason and asserting this particular set of claims about human nature and morality and virtue and all the rest is sort of downstream in some way from humanism. And so they built their own pantheon of humanist heroes. So a lot of it is about the intellectual history of the 19th and early 20th centuries and what these German post-Kantian emigres are thinking about in terms of their own intellectual lineage and how they try to ground all of this in a reimagined version of humanism. And so that can be very misleading. They're not Kant avant la lettre, despite the fact that they're quite Pelagian and so is Kant. What they're doing is very different, and there's a real danger of projecting this contemporary understanding of humanism in the sense in which you're using it, which really is a kind of post-Kantian 19th century construct, backwards.
I want to say one last thing, which is to go back to Montaigne and Shakespeare, because with those two figures, they are in some ways quintessentially humanist. You can't be either of those two people without humanism. But they're also an example of something that's there at the beginning, but is possibly also a sign of the end. So in Montaigne's case, it is, as we talked about very early on, it's a retreat. It is in part a retreat. He was living through a completely hellish time, the wars of religion in France, and he did go into his study, in his library, in his tower, in his castle, on his estate. He just back to the books, because there's a kind of human comfort in being among human beings that you only meet on the page, and therefore they're not going to kill you, basically. And that's part of the story. And then with Shakespeare, at the other end of the scale, for some people, Shakespeare is God, right? Because he sees it all. There came a human being miraculously from some obscure place, Stratford upon Avon, who had this kind of education and somehow seemed to use it to see through us. Not everyone believes that. Some people believe it's all overblown. But for the people who really do worship Shakespeare, there is the possibility that one of the places this project leads to is the possibility of human beings being able to see it all for themselves. And in those two respects, it feels to me we're right at the edge of it, in the way that, as you said, Machiavelli isn't the edge of it. He's maybe blown up part of it, but we're still in the project. But by that point, we're close to the end.
Well, I think we've come full circle, haven't we, to your initial question about whether there is something about humanism that is a kind of escape, a retreat into a world of books and learning and scholarship as a way of insulating oneself from the dregs and corruption and violence of the age. And there was always this piece of it. The line from Petrarch to Montaigne is direct because Petrarch writes this amazing text called On the Solitary Life, which is revolutionary. I mean, in the midst of doing this, so one of the things he's doing is this cultural project of we want to revive Rome and restore the greatness of Italy and all the rest. But meanwhile, he's also living this life of scholarly, non-monastic seclusion. And the non-monastic part is the central part. It's defending a way of life where no wife, no kids, in dedicating one's life to learning, surrounding oneself with these books and one's writing, living, as he says, solitarius sed non solus, which is such a wonderful phrase. It's impossible to translate because of the pun, but it's like solitary but not alone, richly enmeshed in a network of friends, most of whom only exist on the page, as you say, because these are people who are just writing letters to each other, many of whom had never even met each other and would never meet each other, and kind of imagining for himself and then living out a really new way of life. Solitariness or, a life of seclusion was not new. Monasticism was a big thing, but this was not monastic. This was a kind of secular literary seclusion. And it lays the foundations for what Montaigne is doing and all the rest. And so that's there from the beginning, too. And so I think it was shrewd of you to insist on that at the beginning, because I think that's true. Even in the midst of all the rest of this, there is this sense. I mean, even Machiavelli, the most famous letter that survives of his, which he writes as he's writing The Prince, the government of which he's been a part has just fallen. He's been arrested. He's been tortured. He's been exiled from Florence proper. He is out in his farm. And he writes this letter to his friend about being in his study and just relishing his conversations with these old friends, and the old friends are the books. And that's a very humanist thought also. So I think there's something to that.
And the old friends in the books, and then in the case of Shakespeare, the old friends on the stage, these imagined people, they're historical, but Shakespeare makes them people in their own right. And then we are a long way from that other version of humanism, which is about recovering the past in order to better the present. We're in something which is maybe more comforting, but also a little bit more passive, which is we're living through imaginary friends.
Yes. And also at a certain point, we're taking our own next step, less of a sense that what we're producing in drama is just a pale imitation of Aeschylus or whatever. And that's a very different sense. I think that all of this is very much part of the story.
We have got another special live event to tell you about. As part of our great political film series, we are going to be hosting an event at the beautiful and historic Regent Street Cinema in London. I'm going to be talking with Helen Lewis after a screening of the film Network, which was probably the movie that was most often recommended to us by listeners and that wasn't in our original series. It's a film about television, about populism, about the madness of America, and also, even though it was made right in the middle of the 1970s, perhaps a film about Donald Trump. If you would like to come along and watch Network and then hear Helen Lewis and me talk about it, book your tickets now. You can get them through our website, ppfideas.com. Just go to the events page or go to the Regent Street Cinema website. We would love to see you there. Coming up next on the history of revolutionary ideas, we will have reached the Reformation. Our next episode is with the historian Alec Ryrie talking about Luther, one of the most unlikely revolutionaries in all of history. And there will be a special bonus episode too for PPF Plus subscribers about Calvin. Do join us for all of that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave Podcast Network.